The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official-looking, with a return address of the Maple Grove Heights Homeowners Association embossed in gold lettering. I remember thinking it was odd since I'd never joined any HOA. My property had been in my family for 3 generations, long before the pristine subdivision of cookie-cutter McMansions had sprouted up around my modest 10-acre homestead like mushrooms after rain. I opened it while drinking my coffee on the wraparound porch my grandfather built in 1947. The porch that, according to the letter, was now somehow a structural eyesore in violation of community aesthetic standards. My hand started shaking as I read further. Peeling paint, $15,000. Non-approved fencing, $28,000. Unapproved outbuildings, my grandfather's workshop, $47,000. The list went on and on, each infraction more absurd than the last. The total at the bottom made my coffee go cold in my mouth. $350,000 in fines and penalties, due within 30 days, or they would place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. I sat there staring at my land. The ancient oak tree where my father had hung a tire swing, the chicken coop my daughter had helped me build, the vegetable garden my late wife had lovingly tended, and felt something dark and hot rising in my chest. These people, these newcomers with their perfectly manicured lawns and their identical beige houses, thought they could take what was mine, what had been my family's since before their parents were born. They had no idea what they'd just started, because tucked away in a dusty filing cabinet in my basement was a deed. A very old, very interesting deed that I'd never bothered to examine too closely. Until now. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door. Sometimes you have to invite her in and show her where the skeletons are buried. My name is Robert Chen, though everyone calls me Bobby. I'm 56 years old, and I've lived on this land my entire life except for 4 years at State College and 2 years in the Army. My grandfather, James Chen, bought these 10 acres in 1945 when he returned from World War II with a Purple Heart and enough back pay to make a down payment on a small slice of the American dream. Back then, this whole area was farmland and forest, miles from the nearest town. Grandpa built our house with his own hands, board by board, nail by nail. He raised my father here, taught him how to work the land, how to fix anything that broke, how to be self-sufficient. My father did the same for me. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We had what mattered, family, land, and the freedom to live as we chose. The subdivision started going up about 15 years ago. A developer named Marcus Thornfield bought up the surrounding farmland from families who were tired of scraping by, who saw dollar signs instead of heritage. I understood it, even if it broke my heart a little. Farming wasn't easy, and times were hard. But when Thornfield people came knocking on my door with their slick suits and their million-dollar offers, I sent them packing. This land wasn't for sale at any price. They built around me instead. 300 homes, all variations on the same 5 floor plans, painted in approved shades of beige, tan, and warm taupe. They called it Maple Grove Heights, which was ironic since they cut down most of the actual maple grove to make room for their cul-de-sacs. Within 5 years, it was fully developed, populated by young professionals and retirees who wanted the appearance of country living without any of the actual country. At first, we coexisted peacefully. They did their thing. I did mine. Sure, some of them gave me odd looks when I was out feeding the chickens or loading firewood, but I didn't pay it much mind. Live and let live was always my motto. My wife, Sarah, used to sell eggs and vegetables at a little stand by the road. The new neighbors loved it, said it was charming and authentic. Everything was fine. Then Sarah died. Breast cancer, 3 years ago last April. The world lost its color for a while after that. I stopped maintaining things the way I used to. The paint on the porch started peeling. Weeds crept into the garden she'd loved so much. The fence around the chicken coop developed a lean. I wasn't depressed exactly, just tired and alone, and not seeing much point in keeping up appearances. That's when the letters started. First, they were polite, neighborly reminders about maintaining property values. Then they became firmer. Notices of concern from the HOA board. I ignored them all because, as far as I knew, I wasn't part of any HOA. I'd never signed any documents, never attended any meetings, never paid any dues. My property was my own business. The HOA president, a woman named Patricia Whitmore, even came to my door once. She was in her early 40s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wearing what I'm sure was an expensive pantsuit and a smile that never reached her eyes. She explained, very condescendingly, that while my property was technically grandfathered in, I was still subject to certain community standards for the good of everyone's property values. I politely told her where she could stick her community standards. Her smile got even tighter, and she left with a warning that the board had ways of enforcing compliance. I figured she was blowing smoke. I was wrong about that, but she was even more wrong about what happened next. When that $350,000 fine letter arrived, I knew I needed help. I called my daughter Emma, who's a paralegal in the city. She was furious on my behalf and immediately started making calls. She also suggested I dig out all the old property documents, anything that might help establish my independence from the HOA's jurisdiction. That's when I went down to the basement and started going through Grandpa's old filing cabinets. He'd been meticulous about record keeping, had every receipt, every tax document, every piece of paper related to the property going back to the original purchase. Most of it was routine stuff, but then I found a leather portfolio I'd never noticed before, buried under some old National Geographic magazines from the 1960s. Inside was the original property deed from 1945, along with several other documents I'd never seen. I spread them out on my kitchen table and started reading. The original deed was straightforward enough. 10 acres purchased from the Miller family for $2,800. But there were other papers too, including something called a land grant extension from 1947 and a mineral rights and easement agreement from 1952. The language was dense and archaic, full of heretofores and party of the first part legalese that made my eyes cross. But one phrase jumped out at me, repeated several times, including all adjacent parcels as designated in County Plat Map 47J, to extend in perpetuity to all properties bounded by. I had no idea what Plat Map 47J was, but something told me I needed to find out. I took photos of everything and sent them to Emma, then called the county clerk's office. The county clerk's office was a testament to bureaucratic disorder. Filing cabinets lined every wall, and the smell of old paper and toner hung heavy in the air. The clerk on duty, a tired-looking woman in her 60s named Martha, peered at me over her reading glasses when I explained what I needed. Plat Map 47J, she repeated, her brow furrowing. That's going way back. We might have it in the archives. What year are we talking about? 1947, maybe 1952. I said, showing her the photos on my phone. She sighed, but not unkindly. Those old records are in the basement. Haven't been digitized yet. Gonna take some time to find it. I settled in to wait. 3 hours later, Martha emerged from the basement dusty and triumphant, carrying a large rolled document that looked like it might crumble to dust at any moment. We carefully unrolled it on one of the work tables, weighing down the corners with tape dispensers and staplers. Plat Map 47J showed the entire area as it existed in 1947. My grandfather's 10 acres were clearly marked, a small rectangle labeled Chen Property in faded ink. But there were other markings too, lines and annotations in red pencil that extended far beyond the original 10 acres. I traced them with my finger, my heart starting to beat faster. What do these red lines mean? I asked Martha. She leaned in, squinting at the old markings. Looks like easement boundaries. See this notation here? She pointed to some spidery handwriting in the margin. Reserved access rights and mineral considerations. Someone retained certain rights over a much larger area. Who? Can you tell? She pulled out the land grant document I brought and compared the property descriptions. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Well, I'll be. Looks like your grandfather, Mr. Chen. See, it says here he purchased the surface rights to 10 acres, but retained subsurface rights and access easements to. She traced the lines on the map, approximately 340 acres of surrounding land. My mouth went dry. 340 acres? That's impossible. Why would he have rights to land he didn't own? Martha straightened up, warming to the mystery. It wasn't that uncommon back then, especially with mineral rights. A lot of returning servicemen had special grants or programs available to them. Your grandfather might have qualified for some kind of extended land program. Or maybe he bought the rights separately, dirt cheap, when nobody thought they'd ever matter. And these rights would still be valid. If they were properly recorded and taxes were paid, well, let me check something. She disappeared into another room and came back with a thick ledger book. She ran her finger down column after column, flipping pages, muttering to herself. Finally, she looked up. Property taxes on the full 340 acres have been paid continuously since 1947. Whoever's been paying your property tax has been paying on the whole parcel, not just the 10 acres. That's been me, I said slowly. I just paid whatever the bill said. I never looked that closely at the breakdown. Then yes, Mr. Chen. Far as I can tell, you've got legal rights to a substantial portion of the land that subdivision is built on. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you exactly what that means, but you need to talk to one immediately. Can I make copies of all this for you? I drove home in a daze, a thick envelope of copies on the passenger seat beside me. I couldn't wrap my head around it. 340 acres. The Maple Grove Heights subdivision was built on roughly 320 acres. If what Martha said was true, if the documents were legitimate, then I had some kind of legal claim to virtually the entire neighborhood. Emma came up that weekend with her boss, a property lawyer named Daniel Reeves. Dan was a round-faced man in his 50s with kind eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of real estate law. He spent 6 hours at my kitchen table, poring over every document, making phone calls, taking notes. Finally, he sat back and whistled low. Bobby, this is extraordinary. Your grandfather was either very shrewd or very lucky. Most likely both. From what I can piece together, he participated in a now-defunct federal program for returning veterans that allowed them to stake claims on subsurface and access rights to federal land that was being sold off. He paid maybe a couple $100 total for rights that nobody else wanted because there were no valuable minerals in the area, and access meant nothing when it was all farmland anyway. But it means something now, I said. Oh, it means a great deal now. You see, when that developer bought the land from the various farmers, he bought only what they owned, surface rights to build on. Your subsurface rights and easements never transferred because the farmers didn't own them. You did. You still do. And here's the really interesting part. Dan pulled out a document and pointed to a paragraph. According to this easement agreement, you have a right to unimpeded access and use of the surface for the purpose of accessing subsurface rights. That means a subdivision was built on land where you retain substantial legal rights. Can they really fine me $350,000 for violations on my own property? Absolutely not. The HOA has zero jurisdiction over your land. But here's where it gets complicated. You have rights to their land. Specifically, you have easement rights across virtually every property in that subdivision. And they've been building structures, planting trees, installing pools, all potentially interfering with your legal easements. I stared at him. You're saying they're in violation of my rights. Technically, yes. Now, realistically, nobody's going to make them tear down their houses. But you have leverage here, Bobby. Significant leverage. An HOA trying to fine you $350,000. That's almost funny given the legal exposure they created for themselves. Emma was grinning. What do we do, Dan? First, we respond to their fine with a cease and desist. Then we file a quiet title action to establish Bobby's rights beyond any doubt. And then, he smiled grimly, then we have a conversation with the HOA and their developer about how this is all going to work going forward. The law firm's response letter to the HOA was a thing of beauty. Dan had it hand-delivered to Patricia Whitmore's house on a Monday morning by a process server. Emma got me a copy, and I must have read it a dozen times, savoring every word. It began politely enough, acknowledging receipt of the HOA's demand for $350,000. Then it systematically dismantled every single claim, pointing out that my property predated the HOA by 60 years and was not subject to their covenants. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was a detailed explanation of my easement rights across the entire subdivision, complete with maps and the recorded documents from the county. The letter explained that every home in Maple Grove Heights was potentially in violation of my easements and that I would be within my rights to demand access, removal of structures, or financial compensation for the interference with my property rights. Then came dessert, a counterclaim for damages. The HOA's harassment had caused me emotional distress. Their false claims had constituted slander of title to my property, and their fine letter could be construed as attempted extortion. We were demanding $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, plus attorney's fees. Finally, the letter concluded with an offer: withdraw all fines and claims against my property immediately, issue a formal apology, and guarantee in writing that the HOA would never again assert any authority over my land. In exchange, I would be willing to discuss a reasonable easement agreement that would allow the subdivision to continue existing without constant legal jeopardy. They had 10 days to respond. Patricia Whitmore showed up at my door 3 days later. She did not come alone. With her was a nervous-looking man who introduced himself as Richard Sterling, the HOA's attorney, and Marcus Thornfield himself, the developer who had built the subdivision. Thornfield was in his late 60s, silver-haired and tan, wearing a golf shirt that probably cost more than my truck. "Mr. Chen," Patricia began, her previous condescension notably absent, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I said from my porch, not inviting them up. "You tried to fine me for living on my own land. That's pretty straightforward." Thornfield stepped forward, putting on a good old boy smile. "Bobby, can I call you Bobby? Look, I built this community 20 years ago. We did all the proper title searches, bought the land fair and square. I had no idea about these old easements. Nobody did. That sounds like your problem, not mine." Their attorney, Sterling, cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen, while you may technically have these historical rights on paper, I should point out that they've gone unenforced for decades. There are legal doctrines, adverse possession, laches, abandonment, that could severely limit your ability to actually exercise these claimed rights." Dan had prepared me for this argument. "My family has continuously paid property taxes on the full parcel for 75 years. That's not abandonment. As for adverse possession, that requires hostile intent, and the people living here had no idea they were violating my easement because your client," I pointed at Thornfield, "never bothered to tell them about the title issues when he sold them their homes." Sterling's face went pale. That last bit had hit home. If the homeowners ever found out that Thornfield had sold them properties with massive title defects, the lawsuits would be catastrophic. Patricia tried to regain control of the conversation. "We're prepared to be reasonable. We'll withdraw the fines, of course, and we'll sign whatever documents you need guaranteeing we won't bother you again. Surely that's all you want, just to be left alone." "Maybe that was all I wanted," I said, "before you threatened to take my land. My grandfather's land. The place my wife is buried." That last part wasn't technically true. Sarah was cremated and her ashes scattered in the garden, but it had the desired effect. Patricia actually flinched. "What do you want?" Thornfield asked bluntly. "I want proper respect for my property rights. I want compensation for the harassment and stress your HOA has caused. And I want assurances that this will never happen again, not to me, and not to anyone else who might not have the resources to fight back." "We can do that," Patricia said quickly. Too quickly. They were desperate, I realize. They knew how bad this could get. "I'm not finished," I continued. "I've been thinking about those community standards you're so fond of, the rules you use to bully people into conformity. I'm going to retain my easement rights across this entire subdivision, and I'm going to exercise my right to access those easements whenever necessary for the maintenance and use of my property." "What does that mean exactly?" Sterling asked suspiciously. "It means that if I need to drive my tractor across your precious lawns to access different parts of my property rights, I can. If I need to install utilities or access roads across the subdivision, I can. And there's not a damn thing your HOA can do about it, because I have the legal right." You can't be serious," Patricia sputtered. "You destroy property values, people's yards." "I'm completely serious. But here's the thing. I don't actually want to drive my tractor through your neighborhood. I just want to live in peace. So here's my proposal. The HOA will pay me $150,000 in damages for the harassment and stress. You'll issue a formal, written apology. You'll amend your bylaws to explicitly exempt my property from any and all HOA authority, and you'll establish a fund to pay my property taxes in perpetuity. Perpetuity. Thornfield choked. That's extortion. No, Mr. Thornfield, that's compensation for the easement rights I'm agreeing not to exercise. Consider it rent for the land your subdivision sits on. By my lawyer's calculations, if I actually enforce my easements to their fullest extent, you'd be looking at tens of millions in liability. I'm offering to give up those rights for a very reasonable price. The three of them huddled together, whispering urgently. Finally, Sterling spoke up. We need time to review this with our clients. The HOA board will need to meet, and Mr. Thornfield will need to consult with his corporate counsel. You have until Friday, I said. After that, my lawyer files a quiet title action in the lawsuit, and we let a judge decide who owes what to whom. Oh, and one more thing. They looked at me warily. I want Patricia Whitmore removed as HOA president. She's the one who started this mess, and I don't trust her not to try something else down the line. Patricia's face went red. You can't demand that. The residents elect the board. I can demand anything I want. You don't have to agree, of course. But that's my price for a settlement. Take it or leave it. They left. I sat back down in my grandfather's rocking chair and allowed myself a small smile. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening. Dan advised me not to attend. Let them stew, he said, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to see their faces when they realized they had no choice but to accept my terms. The meeting was held at a community center, a modern building at the heart of Maple Grove Heights with a vaulted ceiling and too much recessed lighting. When I walked in at 7 p.m., the room was packed. Word had clearly spread. Easily 200 residents filled the folding chairs, and the buzz of anxious conversation filled the air. Patricia was at the front table with the rest of the board, Jim Ashford, the vice president, Susan Chen, no relation, the treasurer, and two other members whose names I'd never bothered to learn. They all looked grim. Marcus Thornfield sat in the front row with Sterling, and another lawyer I didn't recognize. The conversation died as people noticed me. I felt their eyes as I walked down the center aisle and took a seat in the back. I heard whispers. That's him. The guy with the farm. He's suing us. Patricia gavelled the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on short notice. We have a serious situation that requires immediate attention and a community vote. She took a deep breath. As many of you have heard, the association recently sent a notice of violations to Robert Chen, whose property is surrounded by our community. Mr. Chen's attorney has responded with claims that could, if proven, have significant financial implications for our community. A hand shot up. How significant? Patricia glanced at Sterling, who stood. I'm Richard Sterling, representing the HOA. Without going into too much legal detail, Mr. Chen has presented documentation suggesting he holds certain historical property rights that extend across much of the subdivision. His attorney has threatened litigation that could be very costly. What kind of rights? Someone else called out. Primarily easement rights and subsurface rights dating back to 1947, Sterling said carefully. Again, we're still analyzing the validity of these claims, but in the interest of avoiding expensive and protracted litigation, we're considering a settlement. The room erupted in questions. Sterling raised his hand for quiet. Please, let me finish. Mr. Chen has offered to waive enforcement of these claimed rights in exchange for a payment of $150,000, formal assurances that his property is exempt from HOA authority, and an agreement to cover his property taxes going forward. Why should we pay anything? A red-faced man in a polo shirt demanded. He's just one guy. Take him to court. I stood up. The room went silent. My name's Bobby Chen. I've lived on my land for 56 years. My family's owned it for 75. I never wanted any trouble with anyone. But your HOA decided to try and fine me $350,000 for the crime of living on my own property. So yes, I got lawyers involved. And those lawyers found some very interesting things. Like what? Someone asked. Like the fact that this entire subdivision is built on land where I retain legal rights. Like the fact that your developer, I pointed at Thornfield, who was trying to shrink into his seat, either didn't know or didn't care about title defect when he sold you your homes. Like the fact that I could, if I wanted to be difficult about it, make all your lives very complicated. A woman in the middle stood up. Are you threatening us? No, I'm explaining reality. I don't want to make anyone's life complicated. I just want to be left alone. But if your HOA is going to threaten my home, I'm going to defend it with every legal tool I have. And it turns out I have quite a few. Patricia tried to regain control. Mr. Chen, you're not on the agenda. I don't care about your agenda. I cut her off. These people deserve to know the truth. Your board, under Mrs. Whitmore's leadership, picked a fight with the wrong person. Now you have two choices. Settle on my very reasonable terms, or spend the next several years in court while I exercise my easement rights. That might include driving heavy equipment across your properties, conducting soil surveys, installing access roads, all of which I have the legal right to do. An older man in the front raised his hand. I'm Bill Morrison, retired attorney. May I ask a question? I nodded. Have you actually verified these easement rights with an independent title search? Yes, sir. The county confirmed all documents. My lawyer has done a full title review. Everything is properly recorded, and my family has paid taxes on the full parcel continuously for 75 years. Morrison turned to Thornfield. Marcus, did you know about these easements when you developed this property? Thornfield shifted uncomfortably. There were some old claims in the title report. My attorneys at the time advised they were dormant and unenforceable. But you didn't disclose them to buyers. Silence. Morrison turned back to me. Mr. Chen, your settlement terms seem reasonable given the alternative. I move that the association accept them. Seconded, someone called out. Patricia looked panicked. We need to discuss this further in executive session. No, Morrison said firmly. This is a financial decision that affects the entire community. We vote now, in public, all in favor of accepting Mr. Chen's settlement terms. A forest of hands shot up. I did a quick count. At least 2/3 of the room. Opposed. Maybe 20 hands. Patricia's among them. Motion carries, Morrison declared. Madam President, I suggest you and your attorneys draft the settlement documents immediately. Patricia sat down heavily, defeated. I allowed myself to breathe. It was over. Not quite. A younger woman in yoga pants stood up. I have a question. This all started because the HOA sent Mr. Chen a huge fine, right? For his property not meeting community standards. She made air quotes. Who decided to do that? Patricia's face went pale. The board voted. Actually, Jim Ashford interrupted. Patricia decided to send that letter without a full board vote. She claimed she had the authority as president. You exceeded your authority and created a $150,000 liability for this community, someone shouted. The room erupted again. I quietly made my way to the exit while the residents turned on their board president. I didn't need to see the rest. Patricia Whitmore's reign was over. The settlement documents were signed 2 weeks later in Dan's office. The HOA's new attorney, they'd fired Sterling, was a sharp young woman named Jennifer Park who'd clearly done her homework. She'd negotiated the property tax provision down from perpetuity to 30 years, which Dan advised me to accept. $150,000 plus 30 years of property taxes still came to well over $250,000, and I'd achieved my main goal, securing my land forever. Patricia Whitmore resigned as HOA president the day after the community meeting. I heard through the grapevine that several residents were threatening to sue her personally for exceeding her authority. Jim Ashford took over as interim president and made it clear the new regime would be different. But the real change in Maple Grove Heights went deeper than leadership. The battle had opened people's eyes to what their HOA had become, a petty tyranny more concerned with paint colors and lawn height than actual community. The residents voted to radically reform the bylaws, eliminating most of the aesthetic rules and reducing fines across the board. A month after the settlement, Jim Ashford came to visit me. He was a decent guy, a high school teacher in his early 50s who'd gotten involved with the HOA to try and make things more reasonable. He brought a 6-pack of local beer and an olive branch. I wanted to apologize on behalf of the community, he said as we sat on my porch. What Patricia did was wrong. Hell, most of the rules she was enforcing were wrong. We got so caught up in property values and appearances that we forgot about being neighbors. Apology accepted, I said, handing him a beer. For what it's worth, I don't have any hard feelings toward the residents. Most of you are good people who just wanted a nice place to live. That's generous, considering. He took a long drink. I was wondering, would you be willing to attend some board meetings? Not as a member, but as an advisor? A lot of us are realizing we don't actually know much about property rights, easements, or real estate law. You've gotten quite an education these past few months. I thought about it. My first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into my comfortable isolation. But Sarah's voice echoed in my head. Don't let yourself become a hermit, Bobby. People need people. She'd always been the social one, pulling me out to community events and neighborhood gatherings. I'll do it on one condition, I said. The board takes a field trip to the county clerk's office and learns how to actually read property records. Martha down there's a wealth of knowledge, and it's about time people understood what they actually own. Jim grinned. Deal. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. I became part of the community, not through forced obligation, but through genuine connection. Residents would stop by to buy eggs or vegetables, and we'd end up talking. Some of them asked for advice on gardens or chickens. A few wanted to learn basic carpentry or how to fix their own plumbing instead of calling expensive contractors. One Saturday, a couple in their 30s named Tom and Lisa approached me with an unusual request. Mr. Chen, Lisa said nervously, we have a weird question. We've been trying to start a garden, but our backyard is all clay and rocks. We heard you have amazing soil. Would you let us help in your garden in exchange for learning from you? I must have looked surprised because Tom quickly added, we'd pay you, of course, for your time. No money, I interrupted. But if you really want to learn, come by Saturday mornings. Bring work gloves and a willingness to get dirty. They showed up that Saturday at 7 a.m. So did 3 other couples who had heard about the offer. By mid-morning, my garden was full of eager students learning about composting, companion planting, and the patience required to grow good food. It became a weekly tradition. Some weekends I'd have 15 people out there working the soil and learning skills their grandparents knew, but they'd never been taught. Emma visited one Saturday and was amazed to find my property bustling with activity. Dad, you started a farming commune, she laughed. Just teaching people where food comes from. I replied, but I was smiling. The land, so quiet and lonely after Sarah died, was alive again with voices and laughter. The HOA, under Jim's leadership, underwent its own transformation. They established a community garden on a vacant lot, with individual plots residents could rent for a nominal fee. They started a tool library where people could borrow equipment instead of everyone buying their own. They even revised the bylaws to allow chickens, provided they were kept properly. Not everyone was happy with the changes. A vocal minority of residents missed a strict uniformity, the guarantee that every lawn would be perfect and every house would look magazine-ready. Several families sold their homes and moved to subdivisions with more restrictive HOAs. But most people stayed, and new families moving in were attracted by the more relaxed, community-focused atmosphere. Marcus Thornfield, on the other hand, faced a reckoning. Once word spread about the title issues, several homeowners demanded investigations into their own properties. 3 separate lawsuits were filed by residents who discovered that Thornfield had been aware of various easements and rights-of-way that had never been disclosed. His reputation in the development business was effectively destroyed. I ran into him once at the grocery store, about 6 months after everything was settled. He looked older, smaller somehow. When he saw me, he actually approached. Bobby, he said quietly, I just wanted to say, you had every right to destroy me. You could have demanded millions, made it so I'd lose everything. Instead, you took a reasonable settlement and walked away. Why? I thought about it. I'm not interested in revenge, Marcus. I just wanted to protect my home. You made a mistake 20 years ago, and it came back to bite you. That's life. But I got no interest in grinding you into dust over it. He nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I should have done better due diligence. I should have been honest with buyers. I cut corners and it was wrong. Apology accepted. What are you doing now? Small projects. Renovations mostly. I'll never do another big development, but that's probably for the best. Take care of yourself, Bobby. You too, Marcus. As I watched him walk away, I felt something close to peace. The anger that had burned so hot when I'd first received that $350,000 fine had long since cooled. I'd won, not just in court but in life. My land was secure. My rights were established. And somehow, in fighting for my own boundaries, I'd helped an entire community rediscover what really mattered. 2 years later, Maple Grove Heights looked different. Not physically, the houses were still the same, but energetically, the sterile uniformity had given way to personality. Some lawns were still golf course perfect, and that was fine, but others had vegetable gardens, wildflower patches, or fruit trees. A few families raised chickens in coops built with techniques they'd learned in my Saturday morning classes. The community garden had expanded twice, with waiting lists for plots. The tool library had evolved into a full-fledged resource center where people traded skills. Someone who could fix computers might exchange services with someone who could hem pants or tune up a lawnmower. The focus shifted from property values to quality of life, from appearances to substance. My own property had never looked better. With help from my Saturday regulars, I'd repaired the porch, painted the house, and rebuilt the fence around the chicken coop. Not